I will say hello, first of all, and of course extend my acknowledgement to the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, and thank them for caring for country so that we can do most of the work that we do. I'm really excited to be presenting this, or to be chairing, I'm not presenting, chairing this session this afternoon, which is restoring the soil. Of course, soil has been the theme, a key theme for us throughout today and throughout tomorrow, because soil is the basis of everything. I'm one of those strange researchers of humans and what people and how people engage with the environment and with agriculture. So I'm really interested to hear what we hear this afternoon from our three different speakers, talking in particular ways about how we get more carbon into soil. And we're starting off with John Feehan, who worked at CSIRO for 28 years on the CSIRO Dung Beetle project, a pioneering project that's caused significant improvements in agricultural lands and reduced fly populations, famously in Canberra in particular. And after he left CSIRO, he's continued to promote the agricultural and environmental benefits of dung beetles through his own company, SoilCam. And John has been awarded an OAM, he's one of those with letters at the end of his name, for his contribution to Australian agriculture. So it's a great delight to have him with us today. He has told me he's more comfortable talking to farmers in their sheds, but I think that, talking to people who know a lot on their farms is a really important thing to do. And talking to us today is just a normal thing that, is just part of life. And we can't wait to hear what you have to say. Thanks, John.
Okay. Well, thank you. What you're about to see is supplying some of the answers to some of the problems that we've looked at this morning. Now, I worked at CSIRO for 31 years, and when the funding stopped in the early 90s, at that stage, we'd brought into the country about 60 species of dung beetles. Now, you must remember, no one at all in the world had ever bred dung beetles at the scale we were attempting to do. And there was a lot of trial and error and mistakes made in the early stages. But anyhow, we released about 44 species out into the paddocks in various climates. We now know there are at least 23 of those 44 species established. There are still some species on the continent that haven't even been checked yet by an expert. Now, these... Well, first of all, this whole dung beetle program kicked off. It was the brainchild of a Dr. George Bornemissa. He was an early immigrant. He came to Australia in the early 1950s, and at that stage, immigrants had to work wherever the government told them to work for 2 years. And Dr. Bornemissa worked at a retirement village in Western Australia, about 120 kilometres east of Perth. And while he was there, he was annoyed with the bush fly greatly. We Australians have grown up with them. We can tolerate them. We can play golf, have a barbecue, muster sheep, etc. But an immigrant that comes to this country that's never encountered a persistent insect coming to their face, believe me, it doesn't go down too well. So this undoubtedly occurred with Dr. Bornemissa. He also saw all the unburied dung hanging around the paddocks, and he was an entomologist in Hungary and specialised with dung beetles. So it took him a few years to convince the Australian authorities that we could address this problem. So he entered CSIRO around about 1960. And in 1965, he went off to Africa, selecting species of dung beetles there that had evolved with animals which were similar to our domestic stock. Now, this container of beetles here contains the male and female of all the species that we released. And unfortunately, there are just 2 of all these species at this time that have spread to their climatic and geographic limits on the continent. So there is a whole lot more work to be done. Now, now I'm going to speak about 3 things today: soil fertility, buffalo fly and bushfly control, and reduced nutrient and chemical runoff into creeks, rivers, estuaries, and oceans. Now, when Captain Phillip turned up with the first fleet, he had 44 sheep, 7 horses, and 7 head of cattle. Now, the cattle have developed into a herd of around 28 million at the moment. And there is the problem. Each day in Australia, we have up to 500,000 tonnes of cow dung a day being dropped in the paddocks here in Australia. Now, we're currently importing phosphate fertilisers from Florida, Canada, Russia, China, and Morocco. Now, we often hear of fossil fuel limitations, but what we don't ever hear of is phosphorus limitations, and that's far more important than the fuel, really. Nothing lives and nothing grows without it. Now, here we have a product which is a very valuable product, and we leave it sitting on top of the ground. When it sits there, it breeds bush fly, buffalo fly up north, internal parasites complete their life cycle. The dung pollutes the paddocks, and then it gets washed into the creeks, rivers, estuaries, and oceans. And that's another scene taken across at Braidwood. Whenever I contact a politician, I point out to them that anytime they drive around this continent, or anytime they drive around this tired, burnt out continent, and they see unburied dung piled up in a farmer's paddock, they should think of it as a massive wasted resource. And there is only 5% of Australia has reasonable soil on which reasonable rainfall falls. Now, there are about 5 million of the 28 million cattle are on that 5% of good soil. The other 95% of our cattle is on marginal ground, which deteriorates right down to almost unproductive desert. But that's where the cattle breed, and that's where these dung beetles in the long term can begin to improve soil fertility. Now, our soils are so old and ancient that there are many locations in Australia where you have compacted soil. Now, this is a clod that I dug up with a mattock, and believe me, I had to put every ounce of energy into that swing to dig this clod of soil up. There's been no root penetration in it for millions of years. We've heard this morning the term dead soil, and this is a piece of dead soil. And there are only 2 things that can dig through it: 100 or more horsepower tractors with a ripper, and dung beetles. Dung beetles have actually dug those holes in that material, and they have taken dung down to a depth of 300 millimetres. Now, this dung and the nitrogen and minerals in the dung will certainly attract all types of growth from bushes, plants, and grasses. And the increase in soil fertility, it is slow, but it's a very positive outcome. Dung beetles will bury nearly all types of dung, providing it is out in an open paddock. This is sheep dung being buried. They'll also bury alpaca dung, dog dung, human feces, providing it's out in the paddock. This is a photograph taken down near Gundagai during an extreme drought. But what it does do is indicate just how much dung gets dropped in a paddock if it's not covered up by grass or broken up with machinery. And again, it is a massive wasted resource. This is another negative effect of unburied cow dung. You'll find in every one of those tufts of grass there, if you part the grass, you'll find 2 litres of old cow pad sitting on top of the ground. Now, there's no doubt that the dung and the nutrients in the dung has certainly made the grass grow. However, there's too much nutrient and too many minerals in a small area of soil. Consequently, we get this rank, coarse grass. Stock will shun it even into a drought, all the way through the drought. They will eat the surrounding grass down to the ground level, but they will leave this tufts of grass. Now, we made some calculations at CSIRO, and in some cases, between 10 and 20% of a paddock can, 10 and 15% of a paddock can literally go out of production due to this rank grass. In fact, if it's not eaten, it may as well be a tussock, a thistle, or some other grass. And there is certainly an economic loss attributed to this unburied dung. This is cow dung that's just buried in southern Australia. That the quantum volume of dung there was probably at least 2 litres of dung. And that burial probably took place in less than 24 hours. This dung was dropped on a road near Chinchilla in Queensland. Now, dung beetles have no control over where dung is dropped. So they have evolved to bury it wherever it is dropped. So here we have a gravel road over which semi-trailers were driving. The dung was dropped. There are a few fences up in this region, and the cattle dropped this on a gravel road, and there we have dung beetles taking dung down into that compacted roadway. This again, there was 2 litres of dung or more dropped there. This is in Queensland. And just look what we have. That is not 99% burial, it is 100% burial. Now, this is the CSIRO illustration, and the distance from there to here is about 600 to 700 millimetres, and this distance here is around about 300 millimetres. Now, Dr. George Bornemissa, there are some species of dung beetles in Africa that are almost heading towards the size of a cricket ball, and they roll cricket ball-sized balls of dung when they roll them along the ground. But those bigger beetles take dung down to 1 metre into the ground. Now, we wouldn't dare think of doing that here in this continent. There is no point in taking dung to a deeper depth than the grass roots that we have growing in our paddocks. Now, an agronomist could quite easily speak about this tunnel system for at least an hour. You have the aeration effect. You have the dung being taken underground. Well, one thing I did forget to mention when we saw that dung in the paddocks, when dung sits on top of the ground, 80% of the nitrogen in it evaporates off into the atmosphere. When dung is buried, as in this illustration, that figure is reversed. You get 80% of the dung and the nitrogen put under the grass roots, and 20% goes off into the atmosphere. Each one of these balls of dung has an egg laid in it. That egg hatches, the larva feeds on the ball of dung and develops into another beetle eventually. It burrows back up to the surface, creating another soil disturbance, and flies off to fresh dung elsewhere and repeats the whole process. There is also another great benefit here with regard to nutrient and chemical runoff from farmland. I take school kids out into the paddocks by the busload, and I put 4 litres of water into 2 buckets. And I get one of the students to pour that 4 litres of water onto a tunnel system such as we see here. That whole 4 litres dissipates into the soil in a matter of 4 or 5 seconds. I then get the same student with the other bucket of water. I step a couple of metres away, and the student pours that water out onto the ground where there is no dung beetle tunnel system. And we watch it run off down towards the creek for 4 or 5 metres. Now, as simple as that little demonstration is, it is speaking volumes. Now, for every litre of dung that the beetles take underground, they actually excavate about 1 kilogram of topsoil. In fact, a researcher in Africa put a different marker on this down to a depth of 100 millimetres, And at the end of 5 years, he was able to find his 5 markers down to a depth of 200 and 300 millimetres. So here, Africans have a system, or nature has a system, that actually turns over the topsoil. We may, with our, well, Africa's got some 5,000 different species of dung beetles, and here we are with 23 here. But we may never get to that level of soil turnover here. But if we get something going that occurs, that even if it takes 12 years to turn the soil over, it's certainly better than what we've got going at the moment. Right, well, let's... Now, these are 2 sheets of glass I put together, and this is an actual tunnel system that's been produced by a species of dung beetle around Canberra here. And if you just space the glass a little bit wider than the width of the beetle, you can produce this type of illustration. The school kids are very keen on producing this at school. This brood ball here is actually a larva feeding, and you can watch it develop as a larva, then pupate, and then if they're lucky enough, they travel back up, they can see it emerge. I also run experiments for school kids, just indicating the increase in soil fertility. I use Japanese millet, wheat, or oats, and we can just about squeeze this experiment through in one term, but it's a very popular experiment. I need about 3 hours to tell this story properly. This is also another species that's established around Braidwood in Canberra. You can see this tunnel system here. Just look where the beetle has produced all these brood balls. Just imagine the root system of a lucerne plant finding that tunnel and how healthily it would grow. This is the egg that the beetles produce. That's the brood ball that has been produced by a beetle, a natural one. That larva has finished feeding. It's in the process of pupating, but what it does do is indicate just how small an area of the total brood ball that it has consumed to develop. So the other 3/4 or more of that brood ball is left underground for beetles to, for the soil fertility to be improved. Well, this is a species of dung beetle we harvest up at Narrabri. It comes from around the Sahara Desert. There are 24,000 beetles in that tray. This is another species that comes from Western Australia. It's a winter working species. I've brought 2 million of this species across to the east here. It works May, June, July, and August. Farmers simply purchase the beetles from me. In fact, the cost of the beetles is less than 1 tonne of phosphate fertiliser. In fact, we heard this morning here where fertiliser was up to $1,500 a tonne. Well, I hadn't heard that, but most farmers pay $1,000 a tonne, and farmers pay $800, between $600 and $800 for a colony of beetles. The difference is that farmer will eventually get 1,000 times greater benefit out of the new species of dung beetle than he ever would from 1 single tonne of phosphate fertiliser. And the other thing about dung beetles, I tell beef producers, these beetles will be on your farm for your grandkids. There are some problems with drenches. Some of the chemical companies produce nasty drenches which kill the beetles, but other than that, a farmer doesn't have to change a single farming practice. Now, look what we can do. This was a photograph taken in Western Australia, south of Bunbury. There were 250 head of cattle fed in that paddock for 3 nights, and I took this photograph 2 days after they were moved out. And that's what we can do. There would hardly be a square metre in that paddock at the end of a year that didn't have a tunnel system put back underground. Now, buffalo fly and bush fly control. This buffalo fly in Northern Australia, it is an accidental introduction. It came in from the Timor Islands in 1825. The Indonesians used to bring them across. They let them go in Melville Island, and they would breed there. They'd either come and take them back as adults or shoot them or take them back. But anyhow, on one of those trips, this buffalo fly entered Northern Australia. And believe me, it's one of the most cruel things you could possibly see that affects cattle. in a terribly negative way. In fact, cattle will fail to put on between 30 and 35 kilograms of weight per season if they're subjected to these flies in the numbers you see here. Farmers, to control them, have to put some pretty nasty insecticides onto the animals. And these insecticides, eventually the residues get into the meat, and they don't always dissipate before that meat is released on the market. Each one of those buffalo flies suck blood from an animal 30 times a day. And just like the bush fly, the buffalo fly breed in unburied cow dung. So if you bury the dung quickly, you don't get the buffalo fly in the numbers you see here. That's the result of a buffalo fly constant irritation. Now, the bush flies breed, as I said, in exactly the same way. This photograph was taken here in Canberra. This is good quality dung. You can see the seeds in it. And 2 to 3 litres of dung, good quality dung, can turn out up between 2,000 and 3,000 bush flies. So this is where this massive number of bush flies used to come from, used to. We have 28 million cattle in the country. Each cow drops about 12 piles of dung per day. So if you do your arithmetic, that's where the trillions and trillions of flies come from. But the weak link with both the buffalo fly and the bush fly is at the larval stage. Each fly needs between 5 and 6 days in an undisturbed cow pad to mature, to develop into another fly. So if you bury the dung in 24, 48 or 72 hours, you're just simply removing the bush fly, removing the food supply from the bush fly life cycle. These bush flies are attracted to humans, and they're seeking they're seeking protein from tears, saliva, perspiration, and of course any open wound. And you'll find most of the flies on a human's back or any other mammal, they're females with a full batch of eggs, and they're simply waiting for somewhere. They know damn well they've just got to stay with that mammal long enough and they'll have somewhere to lay the eggs. So they've really got the system worked out well. Now, this photograph is that we refer to these bush flies as the spoiler of the great outdoors. Now, this is my daughter, Sandra. We took this photograph over at Braidwood. We had been working in that paddock and gathering the flies as we moved around, but that's the end result. My daughter, by the way, loves to remind me just how much Elle Macpherson would have charged my company to endure that level of torment. These holes, these are natural dung beetle holes. They have been, these are the holes that students can pour the 4 litres of water into with ease. And if you remember that illustration of the tunnel system, it's not difficult to see why and how that occurs. And that's the roadway photograph. Now, my son-in-law, John Lee, produced this very clever logo. And the whole thing, this dark brown soil up here is a farmer's paddock where there have been insecticides, herbicides, wetting agents, and nutrients from dung and other sources has dirtied the soil and the water. So as the water runs downhill and encounters millions and millions of dung beetle holes and tunnel systems, that contaminated water seeps into the soil. Gravity continues taking the water downhill, but as it gets down towards the creeks, rivers, estuaries, and oceans, it becomes cleaner and clearer water. Now, I put in 2 tenders to the Reef Catchment Authority, who had $443 million was allocated, and I was rejected with both those tenders were rejected. One was that we couldn't produce a result within 2 years was the reason it was rejected. Well, I could have commenced producing a result within 2 years. However, the result wouldn't be fully apparent. And then on the second tender, they claimed we were outside the guideline. Well, we weren't at all. Anytime you see the demise of the barrier reef, they always blame nutrient and chemical runoff from farmland. Now, I don't know what they're doing to reduce it, but whatever they are doing and have spent your money on, believe me, I believe it would not be as efficient as putting dung beetles from Brisbane up to Cape York along the eastern side of that Great Dividing Range there. There were 4.7 million cattle grazing there, and they produced 70 million litres of dung a day. And again, as I point out, these issues, getting beetles on a farm is a one-off operation, and they'd be there forever.
Are you ready, John? So,
Right.
if you didn't get through everything, you might be able to respond.
Well,
yes, questions, please. Could you come down to the microphone?
Well, while you're coming down, I have I have privately released 6,800 colonies at no cost to the taxpayers of Australia or the beef producers. And even this year, there have been 8 species released, and I have released 410 colonies throughout Australia this year.
And they're
Anyhow.
cute. There you go.
Yes.
Hello. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you. No disrespect to the other presentations, but this has been my favourite.
There you go.
So Jenny McClelland have a regenerated farm in Bungendore. So I look through the cowpats to see what's happening with the native dung beetles, because we haven't introduced any yet.
No, these be introduced beetles, not native. The native
Right.
beetles don't come into introduced stock dung.
Oh, excellent. Well, you've answered that question for me. Thank you. So not all cowpats are created equal. From a regenerative grazing cow, lactating cowpat versus a cow that's eating off a fertilized industrial,
Yep,
you know,
a lot of variation.
yeah. So can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, well, of the species that all the species, not all dung is the same type of dung. And this is why Dr. Borna-Missa brought 44 species into the country, because there are horses for courses. Some species will thrive on good, high quality dung, and other species, as I pointed out, will survive on poor quality dung. And we have some species that have evolved around the Sahara Desert. So we use those species during drought periods and also in Northern Australia, you see. In fact, dung beetles is a little bit like a farmer that would like to have about 8 different varieties of grass. And he hopes that some of those varieties of grass will produce fodder no matter what the weather conditions. And it's pretty much the same with dung beetles. You need a full range, anything up to 10 different species and more for the full coverage. And some species work well in spring, others summer, others autumn, and we have winter species. And each species of dung beetles works for about 3 to 4 months. It then goes into hibernation, and another species then has to emerge and take over the next shift in the year. But I can talk. I come from Braidwood and travel through Bungendore. You can talk to me later.
Absolutely. Is this a quick question? Thank you very much for your question.
Make it quick. Susan Hartley, I'm from the northwest of Tasmania on some lovely rich red basalt soil. And when
Woolnorth or somewhere.
No, Woolnorth, no, this is near Wynyard. It's volcanic soil. Anyway, when I first got there 10 years ago, we planned to do all this regenerative farming, did a lot of shelter belts and improvements to pastures. I'd never owned a cow in my life, so they're big animals and I was terrified of them, but I have learnt to love cows. And when I first got there, there were plenty of beetles. They were flying around, they'd hit the fence lines. We had Graham Stevenson. I brought him out to talk to us about how to improve that land. Graham Stevenson, you probably know him, yeah, lovely man.
We worked together.
I bet you did, because he's retired now. But anyway, he identified a couple of species. But we had a rather unusual year last year. We had a lot of rain, very heavy rain periods. I said it was like the Somme. I was out there trudging in mud up to my knees virtually. And this season, we just don't seem to have the dung beetles. I used to hook them out of the troughs. So what I'd like to know is, Are they going to survive these strange variations?
Yeah, they
particularly a wet year.
They probably will come back. So every time I release a species, or send a starter colony off to a farmer, I make sure that, well, through the use of Climax, it's a very easy to run program, and you can very accurately now supply beetles to a precise climate. And every colony I dispatch, it is able to handle the 4 extremes in each designation: the hottest, the coldest, the wettest, and the driest. So it would not be the wet winter. Your problem was probably created through parasiticides, the drenches. There are some pretty nasty drenches on the market, and it's well published research around the world, including CSIRO, all point out the same thing. But I would be, did you use a pour-on or a drench on your cattle?
I did, under the advice of the stock agent, and I haven't used it for over a year because the cows look so bloody fantastic.
The stock
agents just send you up the wrong path.
The stock agent is going to recommend the product that he makes the most profit margin out of. And I strongly suspect, I can talk to you later, that I could name the product.
Certainly.
That's why you don't have
Dung Beetles for my birthday. I turned 70.
Well, here's your man. We can make that happen. All right. Thank you very much. Thanks, John. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think there's lots of questions for John for afterwards as well. So hopefully you'll be able to grab him. But his details, of course, are also on the website. Our next speaker, Wolfram Bust, is coming up now, which is fabulous. And I'm sure that the presentation will appear here shortly behind me.